It's the world's second largest economy. Rapid growth, local government debt, a reliance on exports and investment. Has the Asian dragon bitten off more than it can chew, or concerns over the Chinese economy just an overreaction?
Growth, rapid growth, essentially is an unbalanced process. That GDP growth is not the goal. The goal of any economy is growth in living standards in a sustainable way over a long period of time.
As China's urbanization continues to expand, more people are moving into cities.
I've often said to people in Beijing, your city is actually too small. It should have 30 million.
Next up, we review what former World Bank Country Director for China, Huang Yukon, says is in store for China as it races to become the world's biggest economy. And what he argues may surprise you.
So why should we think unbalanced growth is bad when the only successful countries, their growth processes have all been unbalanced?
People often say that being unbalanced is bad, and the Chinese economic model is unbalanced, that we invested too much while consumed too little. And what do you think?
It depends on how you define this. Growth, rapid growth, essentially is an unbalanced process. If you look at other successful countries in history, and particularly the most recent success cases in East Asia, Japan 50 years ago, South Korea, during the period when they grew at 8, 9, 10% a year for several decades, their growth processes were all unbalanced. This was also true for Singapore. If you look at the United States, 100, 150 years ago, when they were actually industrializing, it had the most unbalanced growth process that we've ever seen. But why should we think unbalanced growth is bad when the only successful countries, their growth processes have all been unbalanced?
And also, how should China avoid this middle class income trap?
Well, if you look at the middle income countries, we realize that historically, over the last 30, 40 years, only about 5 or 6 countries outside of Europe, middle income countries, only 5 or 6 made it to high income. And most of them were in East Asia. The middle income countries in Latin America, they never made it to high income. You don't see any countries in Africa. So it's very hard. Now it turns out that of these economies that have gone from middle to high income, the only ones that did it had unbalanced growth. By the time they got to high income, the economies then became more balanced. If you look at China, where China is, its per capita income level is about $8,000 standardized for prices. You look at the few success cases in East Asia, they all became balanced at the point where their income levels were between 12 to 15,000. If China grows at 7% a year over the next 7 or 8 years, then by 2020, China will begin to become more balanced. But by then, it will become a high-income country.
And there's also argument that when the investment China slows down and the consumption is not strong enough to replace it, what should show up our economy?
What should be the goal of every country? First of all, it's correct to say that GDP growth is not the goal. The goal of any economy is growth in living standards in a sustainable way over a long period of time. So the ideal growth model that spreads over time is one in which consumption and investment is steadily increasing at a fairly rapid pace. And critical to this success, the question is your investment being productive? Are you investing in the right things? So unbalance is not the problem. The problem is to make sure that you invest in the right things.
And also, you've argued that the consumption should not be the projective, and it would be the byproduct of a sustainable economic growth.
So many analysts of China, they look at consumption as a share of the GDP, as a share of the economy. And China's consumption share, which is currently 35%, is the lowest of any major economy. So the natural inclination is to say that somehow consumption is too low, or it's not growing rapidly enough. But if you don't look at consumption as a share of GDP, but just look at the growth of consumption, the growth of household consumption, or the growth rate of individual consumption, in real terms, adjusted for inflation, consumption has been increasing by about 8 to 9% a year for several decades. That's the highest in the world. So there's very little logic in arguing that growth of consumption should actually increase. After all, it's already increasing much faster than any other country.
If this consumption is not key to a sustainable growth, and what is the key to sustainability?
Growth, defined by economists, is the capacity of the economy to produce goods and services over time. Growth is determined only by two things: investment and productivity. If you invest properly, you build the capacity to produce. If you have technology, you have innovation, you have good practices, and you manage the economy well, then your productivity increases. An economy which is growing sustainably, their capacity to produce is increasing, but they also have people who are willing to buy their goods and services. This is where consumption comes in. If people do not consume, then some of your products are not bought. So you have excessive inventories. And that means firms either have to sell to the government or they have to trade and sell to other countries. But that's not growth. That's essentially who's going to buy my products. And then companies are very skilled at that. They look for markets. They look for here, they look for abroad, they look for the United States. So that's a different kind of an issue.